Good evening, everybody, and thank you to Gillian for the introduction. Thank you to the Centre for City Ecology for inviting me to speak to you about Section 37. You'll find that some of what I have to say overlaps with what Patrick said, and in fact there are some very strange overlaps, as you'll see. But I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach in talking about Section 37. What I'd like to do is, first of all, walk you through a typical development process that I've been involved with and I'm familiar with, and so that you get a sense of how the development application process interacts with the Section 37 approach. I'm going to then talk about why we have Section 37. I think Patrick touched on it. I'm going to reinforce some of the points that he made. And then I'm going to just raise a few ideas that I have about how the Section 37 process can be improved. So the example that I'd like to walk through is Yonge and Merton Street. It's a site on Yonge and Merton Street. You see it outlined in blue. It's right on the edge of the Mount Pleasant Cemetery, if you know the area. It's a very prominent site. The context, well, first of all, let me tell you what the zoning is for the site, because everything starts from that. The zoning allows for 2.5 times density coverage for residential on that site. And about the height is 38 meters, about 12, 13 stories. And along Merton Street, it's about 7 stories. Okay? So that's about 21 meters. So that's what's in place as zoning. Now, the reality is that this site is very close to a subway station. Davisville subway station is within a few minutes walking distance. It's there are no overlook issues to speak of the site. It's right on the edge of the park. It's a great location for a good building. It's ideal for intensification, and in line with the kind of provincial policy that we now have, this is the kind of site that they're looking for to intensify so that transit usage becomes better and that the people live closer to where they work and live, etc. Many of you probably know this already. So in fact, the zoning is out of date. The developer who purchases the site has to pay a price that doesn't reflect the zoning but also reflects the premium, the expectation of development that exists on that site. So that premium is incorporated into the site. So the developer purchases the site, pays the premium, applies for a rezoning based on, in this case, the highest buildings that are in the surrounding area. And there's some 25-story residential buildings that are not far away from here. So that the application was a little bit higher than that. So because, again, this is a very prominent site right on Yonge Street, etc. The application is made. There are a number of studies that are required for an application. So the applicant has to look at traffic, parking issues, views, pedestrian comfort, wind, sunlight, availability of community services, green development opportunities. These are all studies that the developer does through consultants, et cetera, and submits them to the city. The city then takes all this information, city staff take this information and write a preliminary report. In this case, they wrote a report saying, well, it's worth looking at this further. Let's have a community meeting, and here's a number of issues that we want to look at more deeply as we assess the application. One of the issues is height. So that's one of the things that's outstanding that has to be resolved and looked at. And just to give you a sense of the context of this area, it's on Yonge Street. There's these other buildings, and then further off, buildings you don't see are even higher than this. So the question becomes, what should the height be here on this site? What's the appropriate height? Well, there's no real rule that will determine what the appropriate height be. It'll be a combination of a number of things. The councillor has an opinion. The city staff have an opinion based on certain kinds of analysis and precedents that exist. The community may have an opinion. The developer, of course, has an opinion. And with the outcome that emerges, it has to take into account all of these kinds of things and is usually negotiated. And the success to the developer depends to some extent on how how well his consultants do, people like Patrick Devine and me sometimes, and others as well. The question, this is the first point I'd like to make, the first really substantive point, is the question like some of you may have is, why can't we have a zoning regime where this kind of negotiation doesn't happen? Like, why isn't it possible just to set up a zoning where you say you can't go beyond this, and that's it? Well, first of all, in Ontario, every property owner has the right to apply for rezoning right off the bat. So they have the right to apply. Every single property owner has that right. So, and the municipality has a responsibility to assess that application in a fair and objective way. If it were possible to pre-zone everything in a way which reflected the optimal height and density on a site, that would be great. That would be absolutely terrific. I'd be all in favor of that. I think a lot of people would be all in favor of that. It is, in fact, if you think about it, impossible to do that. Certainly, in my opinion, it's impossible to do that. You think about all the different kinds of sites that have development potential in the city. Some are smaller, some are larger, some have historic buildings on them, some have parks adjacent to them, some have buildings that aren't historic but may be worth saving and incorporating into the development. There's corner sites. There are sites that are very tightly in the middle of developed blocks that are going to exist. There are different kinds of impacts of development depending on the circumstances. So the context of development changes almost from site to site around the city. And zoning is a tool which is a very blunt tool, which was really invented to protect development from happening, to protect communities, to leave them the way they are. That's the origin of zoning. And so as a tool for areas which could redevelop, it's not a good tool to use. It's not an appropriate tool, and it usually misses the mark. In some cases, it's very good. So again, it would be terrific to have a regime where it didn't require negotiation and a situation where you had to come to a deal. But in fact, that's not the case. And there are also no hard, firm formulas for determining what the appropriate height should be. So let's get back to our example. Here's what emerged as a development application and that which was eventually approved by the city. The development is about 25 stories. It's 5 stories along Merton Street. There's a green kind of shed along the edge of the development adjacent to the sidewalk. And it relates to the Beltline Park, which is right adjacent to it, so there are walkways, et cetera, incorporated into the development. And again, so this was negotiated, and it does work on this site. It's a particular site. There are no impacts and no overshadowing, et cetera. It's not great that it has to happen of this, but it's like democracy. It stinks, but it's the best system we have. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. So then, having come up with this development that the staff and the councillor and the community and developer all agree to, what happens next in terms of Section 37? Well, this is where it gets a bit interesting, because the staff have to determine what the value of the increased density is. And how is that done? Well, the city sends appraisers. They have their own appraisers, and they try to determine what the value of the increase is. And then there's a kind of rule of thumb that's applied that isn't quite exact, and it's between 10 and 30% maybe, depending on the circumstances. And so you may wonder, and so there's a kind of strange alchemy that takes place in the back rooms at City Hall, and to figure this out. And there's usually not a lot of give and take about that. The value of the increased density is done, it's determined, that's it. And you have to ask, again, why can't you just have a formula to figure this out? Why is it done in this particular? Why isn't it nailed down? And again, if you think of it, you have many different circumstances. In this particular case, the zoning was out of date, and the zoning does not reflect even a reasonable development option that might be built on this site. And the land price that is paid, that anybody would pay for that site, reflects that doesn't reflect the outdated thing. It reflects the expectation of additional density. So that has to be factored into. And there's lots of sites where the zoning is out of date, the official plan has been brought, which is another document, has been brought more in line, but that's not reflected in the zoning. What if, for example, there's another situation where there's a heritage building on the site? How do you factor in the value of that site and how that heritage building and keeping that heritage building affects the value of the increase in density? What's that worth in terms of keeping for the city? What if you have, as Patrick explained in some situations, a plan of subdivision as well as Section 37? And the plan of subdivision secures a number of benefits as part of that agreement. And there have been cases like this in North York that I'm familiar with for improvements to bridges or roads, et cetera, and a whole variety of things. How do you factor that in and determine what's left over as an increase that should be part of Section 37? So that's the second big issue, if you like, is like this formula, how to determine the value. So it's only at this point that once you've determined what the value of the increase is, usually in the development process, this is when you begin to talk about what the benefits are. Well, I think Patrick alluded to this. It's a bit late in the day to start talking about benefits. Wouldn't it be better if you were able to talk about not the value, but the benefits, the things that you might want to improve? So in this case, the benefits were talked about near the end, and we ended up with this, about $900,000 worth of benefits, most of which are far away from the site. You know, they're not even close to the site. The one that's closest is the improvements for the Beltline. One of them is one subway stop away at Yonge and Eglinton. And that's the sort of thing that happens if you haven't thought about what the benefits might be ahead of time, or how to factor that into the development process from the outset. And so you end up, in the example that Patrick gave, here's another very specific example with much of the benefit going off-site. There are examples, however, where the process is a little bit different. Councillor Adam Vaughan in the ward that we're in has set up a process where he's engaged community groups at the outset and asked them to give him ideas of the kinds of improvements that would make sense. He's assembled that and put that together into a program where he's then equipped. And he is a councillor that's involved in Section 37 very directly, but he's equipped ahead of time. It's very transparent, and he's done homework ahead of time. Apparently, Councillor Kristen Wong-Tom and Councillor Mike Layton are also going through a similar process using the model that Councillor Vaughan. There may be other councillors that are doing this. And so one of my conclusions is that given that councillors are going to be involved in this, that's a really good thing to do, and perhaps there should be a protocol at City Hall that each councillor must go through this kind of process, and then have at least some basis to discuss Section 37 benefits ahead of time. So let's get to the second point, and here's where it gets interesting, because I used exactly the same image, not knowing that Patrick is going to use this. So why do we have Section 37? Why did the province introduce Section 37? I think Patrick said why he did, why the province did, at least to some extent, the idea of the vertical changes to development, capturing improvements to the city in the same way that the flat plan of subdivision kinds of approvals would achieve. But in fact, let's make a deal planning has been around for years and years and years. It's not a recent phenomenon. It works in almost every municipality in North America to a greater or lesser degree with greater or fewer controls. A very famous example in Toronto is the Bank of Nova Scotia. A recent example is the Bank of Nova Scotia, which is at King and Bay, where I think it predates, in fact, Section 37, and there was a negotiated agreement where there was a contribution to affordable housing at Jarvis and Dundas. So there was a site which is now developed for co-ops and nonprofit housing, and there was public art incorporated and public space improvements as well. So that is an example, predates Section 37. The problem with those kinds of arrangements without a Section 37 framework is that they were there was no way of securing them. And so there were kind of gentlemen's agreements between the developer and the city, which if one or the other party decided not to honor, there really probably wasn't very much of a leg to stand on. So Section 37, I think Patrick quite correctly pointed out, is a way of securing the benefits that get negotiated through the development process. And it's a legally binding agreement. There's an example in Ottawa where there was a development that was approved, and the mayor negotiated I think it was a portrait gallery that was supposed to be incorporated into the development. The funding for the gallery fell through. The gallery was never built. The development got built, and there was no real benefit to the public as a result of that. And with the Section 37 agreement, I think it would have been a bit of a different situation. It would have had to be renegotiated. I'm actually convinced that the province, when they introduced Section 37, they thought that we'd end up with a two-tiered zoning, a lower tier with no benefits, a higher tier where there would benefits provided. And I don't think it's possible to have such a rigid development system. I think the province, the people who thought this might happen, were somewhat removed from the day-to-day realities of the development process and were probably hoping for the best. That was certainly my experience when I was working at the City of Toronto years ago and talking to people at the province. They were really hoping that that was the kind of thing that would happen. The second reason why it's a good idea is because the city has benefit. And I got the same 116-page book from the city about Section 37 benefits. And here's the way I put the numbers together. So the benefits in terms of dollars are $224.25 billion in today's dollars, but that doesn't include the in-kind benefits. So there's a lot of other benefits that are in kind that haven't been factored in. These are just the financial benefits. The central wards, 19, 20, 27, account for almost half of these benefits. Ward 23, which is Willowdale, where the North York Centre is, accounts for a significant amount. This brings up a question. These are the wards which are attractive for development. And they're the most attractive wards often to live in, etc. It's not surprising that developers want to move there. The greatest need in the city for improvements and for benefits, however, are in areas where little development happens. And so the question is there a way of addressing those needs? Because those are the greatest needs. There's the Jane Finch areas, there's the Thornhills, the areas around Thorncliffe Parks, the areas around the city which need a lot of assistance and may not have development approvals for a long time, but yet need something right now. So it's another question. I'll leave that hanging for now. Patrick went through some of the kinds of benefits very specifically, but they include improvements to parks, improvements to community facilities and libraries, public art, daycare facilities. Daycare was very big in the early days, particularly when a lot of office development happened, so a lot of workplace daycares were equipped and provided rent-free to daycare operators. The city worked on that. Heritage preservation is a big part. Space for the arts, Witchwood Barns was already mentioned. Now, there are some unconventional examples. All of these and most of the monies goes into capital improvements, real hard capital dollars. Some of the monies and Section 37 monies have gone towards studies. City staff didn't think this was a particularly good idea. Councillors pushed through this. So there was a study on Queen Street, there's a study of John Street, and there are now being funds pooled from development and around the entertainment district towards the eventual improvement on John Street. And this raises another issue for me, and that is whether all of the monies, in fact, or the city staff in a set of guidelines around Section 37 have insisted that the money should be for capital improvements. And I'm not convinced that that's necessarily appropriate or complies with the legislation. I think the legislation, as Patrick read it, is pretty broad and can be broadly interpreted. And why not put money, for example, into a maintenance fund or an improvement fund that gets drawn on over time, particularly in these days where the city doesn't have a huge amount of resources to do the kind of upkeep that's necessary in various ways. So to summarize this part of the presentation, Horse trading predates Section 37. Section 37 provides a way of securing agreements. Section 37 has generated many, many benefits for the city. But in all of this discussion, there are a number of questions that have been raised. Why, first of all, should there only be monies applied to capital improvements? How can we figure out whether other areas should benefit? The other observation I would make is that those examples where there have been in-kind improvements have worked best as compared to funding for improvements, particularly for off-site improvements. Because you actually see it gets usually developed at the time the development takes place. So if it's a new park, if it's a space in the building for affordable housing or artist housing, or a cultural facility, community facility, these are real tangible things that are within the development. And in my mind, that makes sense. One of the questions that some people have raised is, this money that gets contributed goes into general revenues, and then do we have an accounting of whether it's ever spent on the kinds of things that are done? And I haven't had a successful answer of that. And as far as I know, there's never really been a monitoring going back over all of these agreements to monitor that, in fact, those funds have been used in that way. So my last slide is how can Section 37 be improved? Based on the discussion so far and from the various people that I've talked to, first of all, early community involvement. As Patrick pointed out, and I agree with him, councillors will continue to be involved in Section 37, but if there were a protocol to get them to get communities to identify what the benefits might be ahead of time, and then to engage when development comes ahead, early on, saying these are the kinds of benefits that we're thinking about. The money and how many of those benefits will have to be figured out as the process unfolds. Second, so that's the second point, discuss the nature of the benefits early in the development process. Third is to broaden the set of benefits to include maintenance funds. I think that makes sense. I think there would have to be controls to make sure that you could set up these kinds of funds, and that they would be used in that way, and that they would be independent of the general revenues of the city. And I think it's really important to think about whether it's possible to distribute some of the funds to areas in need of the city. Now, the city does try to get some monies for affordable housing that are more generally applied. The problem these days is there are no senior government affordable housing programs, so it's really difficult for just the city and developer to come up with meaningful affordable housing that meets the needs of people really in need. So that's one, and public art was another. But there needs to be a way to I think, address those communities that are the priority, the communities in need, as well as those that are successful at attracting development. Thank you very much.